Welcome to the world of science fiction where extraordinary tales come to life. Enjoy the journey. Jace Vero's ship, the Iron Manticore, groaned as it descended through Proxima 9's toxic orange skies. The planet was a wasteland of dust storms and black market outposts, perfect for a man who didn't want questions. His armor, scared from plasma fire, hummed softly as the landing gears deployed. Fuel reserves at 12%. The ship's air droned. "Shut up, I know," Jace muttered, running a hand through his dark, sweat-damp hair. The last job had gone sideways. Another bounty turned firefight, and now he needed a refuel without attracting attention. The outpost was a rusted husk, its neon signs flickering like dying stars. Inside, the air smelled of oil and something sweet. Alien spices, maybe. A few rough-looking Proximans eyed him, but said nothing. Humans were rare here. Then he saw her. Behind the counter stood a slender Proximan girl, her skin a shimmering cobalt blue, her hair like liquid silver cascading down her back. Her large, luminous eyes widened as he approached. "Grade 4 reactor fuel," Jace said, slapping a credit chip on the counter. "And make it fast." Yes, sir," she stammered, her voice melodic but nervous. As she worked, Jace noticed the metallic bracelets on her wrists. Intricate, glowing bands that pulsed faintly. His jaw tightened. Slave cuffs. He'd seen them on fringe worlds where the Alliance's laws didn't reach. Without thinking, he grabbed her wrist. "What are you?" she gasped. "Hold still." His combat glove's laser cutter hissed, slicing through the first bracelet. It clattered to the floor. "No, stop," she cried, but Jace was already cutting the second one. "Relax," he said, tossing the broken bands aside. "You're free now." Instead of gratitude, her face crumpled. Tears welled in her star-bright eyes. You ruined me," she sobbed, clutching her bare wrists. Jace froze. "What?" "Those were purity bracelets," she cried. "Now no one will marry me." Before he could respond, a hulking Proximan with 4 arms stormed over. "What's going on, Lyria?" The girl, Lyria, whirled on Jace, her tears glinting in the dim light. "He removed my bracelets, father. By our laws, he has to marry me." Jace's blood turned to ice. The Proximan's eyes narrowed. Then, to Jace's horror, he grinned. "Well then," the alien rumbled, "we have a wedding to plan." Jace stared at the massive Proximan, Lyria's father, his mind racing. Marriage. To an alien girl he'd just met. This wasn't how bounty hunting was supposed to go. "You're joking," Jace said flatly. The Proximan's grin didn't waver. "Our laws are clear. Remove the bracelets, claim the bride." Lyria wiped her tears, her silver hair shimmering under the outpost's flickering lights. "You didn't know," she whispered, "but the law is the law." Jace's hand drifted toward the blaster at his hip. He could fight his way out. He'd done it before, but the way Lyria looked at him, equal parts anger and something else, curiosity. It made him hesitate. "Fine," he growled, "but it's temporary. I've got contracts waiting." Lyria's father, introduced as Vorik, clapped all 4 hands together. "The ceremony will be at dusk. Until then, you will prepare." The Proximan village was a cluster of domed structures built into the cliffs, the orange sun casting long shadows as Jace followed Vorik and Lyria. The locals stared openly, whispering behind their hands. Humans were rare here, and human grooms unheard of. Lyria walked stiffly beside him, her bare wrists now wrapped in thin silver cloth. "You don't have to do this," she muttered. "There's another way." Jace raised an eyebrow. "Oh, if you defeat a Krethak in single combat, the bond is void." "Oh what?" Before she could answer, a deep horn sounded. The crowd around them parted as a monstrous figure emerged. A Krethak, easily 8 feet tall, its armored hide covered in scars, tusks jutting from its lower jaw. "That," Lyria said weakly. The beast snarled, saliva dripping from its maw as it locked eyes with Jace. The crowd erupted into cheers. Vorik leaned in. "Change your mind about the wedding, human." Jace cracked his knuckles. "Nah, I fought worse." The fight was brutal. The Krethak moved faster than anything that size should, its claws tearing gouges in the packed earth. Jace dodged, rolled, and when the beast lunged, drove his combat knife into its thigh. The crowd gasped as black blood sprayed. The Krethak roared, swinging wildly. Jace ducked, then slammed his armored fist into its jaw. Bone crunched. The beast staggered. One final shot from Jace's hip blaster between its eyes, and the Krethak collapsed. Silence. Then the Proximans erupted into cheers. Lyria's eyes were wide. You actually killed it." Jace wiped blood from his lip. "So, no wedding." Vorik laughed. "Oh, you've earned the wedding now. That was just the pre-ceremony." Jace groaned. By nightfall, he stood beneath twin moons, Lyria beside him in a gown that shimmered like starlight. The elder chanted in a tongue Jace didn't understand, wrapping their wrists with a cord that pulsed with heat. "Say the words," Lyria whispered. "What words?" "Just say, 'I accept this bond.'" Jace hesitated, but her hand was warm in his, and damn it, she'd trusted him in that fight. "I accept this bond." The cord glowed white-hot, then dissolved into their skin. The crowd cheered. Lyria's smile was small but real. Then Jace's comms unit buzzed. A message from his old partner, Reichel. "Jace, you've got trouble. The Syndicate knows where you are." Jace's blood ran cold. Lyria frowned. "What is it?" He forced a grin. "Nothing. Just wedding nerves." But trouble was coming. The wedding feast lasted deep into the night. Jace sat beside Lyria, picking at the strange, spiced meats and sipping the Proximan liquor that burned like fire going down. The locals kept slapping him on the back. Apparently, killing a Krethak made him a legend, but his mind was stuck on Reichel's warning. "The Syndicate knows where you are." He glanced at Lyria. She was laughing at something a village elder said, her silver hair catching the torchlight. For someone forced into this marriage, she didn't seem unhappy. "You're staring," she murmured, turning toward him. "Just wondering if you regret this yet," Jace said. She tilted her head. "You saved me from a lifetime of shame. And you killed a Krethak barehanded. Most Proximan women would kill for a husband like you." Jace snorted. "Yeah, well, don't get too attached. I'm not exactly the settling down type." Lyria's smile faded slightly. Before she could respond, a scream cut through the night. The feast went silent. Then, gunfire. Jace was on his feet, blaster drawn, before the second shot rang out. The crowd scattered as dark figures stormed into the village. Syndicate enforcers. Their armor was sleek, black, and marked with the crimson serpent sigil of the galaxy's most ruthless crime cartel. Jace cursed. He'd stolen from them 6 months ago, a payload of quantum cores, and they'd been hunting him ever since. Jace Varro, the lead enforcer, called, his voice distorted by his helmet. "You owe the Syndicate a debt." Lyria grabbed Jace's arm. "What did you do?" "Nothing important," Jace muttered. Then, louder, "You want me? Come and get me." He fired. The shot hit the enforcer square in the chest, but the armor absorbed it. The Syndicate soldier laughed. "Run," Jace hissed to Lyria. She didn't move. The enforcers opened fire. Jace dragged Lyria behind a stone pillar as plasma bolts scorched the air around them. The Proximans were screaming, fleeing into the cliffs. Vorik bellowed orders, rallying the village warriors, but their crude energy spears were no match for Syndicate tech. "We have to get to my ship," Jace said, ejecting a spent cartridge. Lyria's eyes were wide with fear, but also something else. A flicker of anger. "You brought this to us," she whispered. Jace grimaced. "Yeah, and I'll get you out of it. He peeked around the pillar. 6 enforcers, advancing. No way he could take them all. Then Lyria grabbed his wrist. Her touch burned. Not metaphorically, actually burned. Jace yelped, yanking his hand back. What the hell? Lyria's skin was glowing. Not just her bracelets, her entire body pulsed with a deep cobalt light. You're not the only one with secrets, she said. Then she moved. Jace had seen a lot of crazy things in his life, but watching Lyria, delicate, soft-spoken Lyria, slam her fist into an enforcer's chest and send him flying 10 feet was near the top of the list. The syndicate soldiers froze. Lyria didn't. Her movements were a blur, every strike crackling with energy. She shattered armor with her bare hands, dodged plasma fire like it was nothing. And when the last enforcer tried to flee, she leaped, landing in front of him with terrifying grace. Tell your masters, she said, her voice echoing strangely, that Proxima 9 is protected. Then she knocked him out cold. Silence. Jace stared. Vorik stared. The few remaining villagers stared. Lyria's glow faded. She swayed, then collapsed. Jace caught her just in time. Back in their dwelling, Lyria stirred weakly. Jace had propped her up on the sleeping pallet, his mind still reeling. "What are you?" he asked. She sighed. "Proximan. But different." Vorik stepped inside, his expression grim. "The syndicate won't stop. They'll send more." Jace clenched his fists. "Then we run." "No," Lyria said softly. "I'm tired of running." She looked at Jace, her eyes fierce. "You want to be free of me? Fine. But first, help me destroy the syndicate outpost on this moon. Then we're even." Jace should have said no, should have grabbed his gear and left. Instead, he grinned. "All right, wife. Let's go to war." The plan was suicide. That was the first thought that crossed Jace's mind as Lyria laid out her strategy. The syndicate outpost was a fortress, high walls, automated turrets, and at least 50 enforcers, and they were going to attack it with what? A handful of village hunters, his half-charged blaster, and whatever weird energy Lyria could summon before passing out again. But the look in her eyes, that fierce, unyielding glint, made arguing impossible. "You're insane," Jace muttered, checking his ammunition. Lyria tightened the straps of her borrowed armor. "And you're still here." He couldn't deny that. They moved under cover of darkness, the twin moons casting just enough light to navigate the jagged canyons leading to the outpost. Vorik and 6 Proximan hunters followed, their energy spears crackling faintly. Jace had tried to convince them to stay behind, but Vorik had just laughed. "My daughter fights. I fight." Now, crouched on a ridge overlooking the outpost, Jace surveyed the defenses. The place was lit up like a starport, enforcers patrolling the perimeter. "We'll never get in," one of the hunters whispered. Jace smirked. "Watch me." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small disc-shaped device. Lyria frowned. "What's that?" "Old human trick. EMP pulse." He activated it, the disc humming softly. "Gives us 60 seconds of chaos. Turrets go dark, doors unlock, lights out. After that, it's up close and messy." Vorik's eyes gleamed. "I like messy." Jace tossed the disc. The explosion wasn't loud, just a sharp crack of energy. But the effect was instant. The outpost's lights died. Alarms warbled weakly, then cut off. The turrets slumped like dead beasts. "Go," Jace hissed. They sprinted for the gates. Inside, the syndicate enforcers were shouting, scrambling in the dark. Jace took down the first 2 with silent knife work, their bodies hitting the ground before they knew he was there. Lyria moved like a shadow beside him, her hands glowing faintly. Not enough to give them away, but enough that Jace saw the strain on her face. "Save your strength," he whispered. She ignored him. They cleared the outer corridors fast, the Proximan hunters flanking them. Then they hit the central chamber and froze. A dozen enforcers stood ready, their weapons trained on the doors. And in the center of the room, smirking, was Corvath. Jace's stomach dropped. Corvath was Syndicate Elite, a hulking brute with a cybernetic arm and a reputation for cruelty. He'd been hunting Jace for years. "Vero," Corvath rumbled. "I knew you'd come." Jace stepped forward, blaster raised. "Miss me?" Corvath laughed. Then he moved. The fight was a blur. Jace ducked a swing from Corvath's metal fist, the air whistling where his head had been. He fired, once, twice, but the Syndicate boss barely flinched. Lyria leaped into the fray, her fists crackling with energy. She drove two enforcers back with a single strike, but Jace saw her stumble. She was weakening. Vorik and the hunters fought like demons, but they were outnumbered. Jace took a hit to the ribs that sent him crashing into a console. Pain flared, but he forced himself up, just in time to see Corvath grab Lyria by the throat. "Pretty little thing," Corvath sneered. "I'll enjoy breaking her." Something inside Jace snapped. He didn't remember charging. Didn't remember pulling the combat knife from his boot. All he knew was the roar in his ears as he drove the blade into Corvath's side. Once, twice, again, until the Syndicate boss staggered back, shock in his eyes. "You." Jace didn't let him finish. He grabbed Corvath's cybernetic arm, wrenched it back until the servos screamed, and tore it clean off. Corvath howled. Jace kicked him to the ground, pressed the barrel of his blaster to the man's forehead, and paused. Lyria was watching. He saw the hesitation in her eyes, the doubt. With a snarl, Jace flipped the blaster and pistol-whipped Corvath unconscious instead. "Get the hell off my planet," he growled to the remaining enforcers. They ran. The outpost was theirs. Lyria sagged against a wall, her glow flickering out. Jace caught her before she could fall. "You okay?" he asked, voice rough. She touched his face. "You didn't kill him." Jace shrugged. Didn't feel like it. The lie hung between them. They both knew the truth. He'd stopped because she wouldn't have wanted it. Vorik clapped him on the shoulder. "The Syndicate won't forget this." "Good," Jace said. "Let them remember what happens when they mess with us." "Us." The word slipped out before he could stop it. Lyria smiled. The Syndicate didn't wait long. 3 days after the outpost raid, the scanners on Jace's ship lit up with incoming signatures. 6 warships, bristling with weapons, descending toward Proxima 9. Jace stared at the screen, his gut twisting. They were outmatched, outgunned, and Lyria, still recovering from whatever power she'd unleashed, could barely stand without swaying. "We should run," he said, turning to her. Lyria sat on the edge of the cot in the Iron Manticore's med bay, her silver hair dull, her blue skin paler than usual. But her eyes were sharp. "No, Lyria. If we run, they burn the village. My people die." She stood, gripping the wall for support. "I won't let that happen." Jace wanted to argue, wanted to throw her over his shoulder and blast off this rock. But he knew that look. She'd fight him. And worse, she'd be right. "Then we fight smart," he said. The plan was desperate. Jace's ship was fast, but it couldn't take on 6 Syndicate warships. What it could do was lure them into the planet's ion storm belt, a swirling mass of charged particles that scrambled sensors and weapon systems. Lyria would stay behind. "You're not strong enough," Jace told her, strapping into the pilot's seat. She grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. "And you're not dying for me." Then she kissed him. It was fierce, desperate, like she was pouring every ounce of stubborn will into it. When she pulled back, Jace's pulse was racing. "Come back," she whispered. He nodded, then launched. The storm belt was chaos. Lightning arced across the Manticore's hull, the ship shuddering as Jace wove through the turbulence. Behind him, The syndicate ships followed, too arrogant to realize the trap. "Come on, you bastards," Jace muttered, banking hard. One by one, their systems failed. A cruiser spun out, slamming into another. A third got caught in a plasma vortex, its engines overloading in a brilliant explosion. But the lead ship, Korvath's flagship, held steady. Jace's comm crackled. "Running won't save you, Vero," Korvath snarled. Jace grinned. "Who's running?" He flipped the ship, firing every weapon he had straight into the storm's heart. The explosion lit up the sky. Jace woke up in pieces. The Manticore was wrecked, half buried in the dunes. Smoke filled the cockpit. Pain screamed through his ribs. But he was alive. Barely. He staggered from the wreck, squinting against the sun, and froze. Lyria stood in the sand, her arms raised, her body glowing like a star. Around her, the syndicate survivors knelt, their weapons discarded. Vorik and the hunters stood guard, but they weren't needed. Lyria's power pulsed in the air, a silent threat. Leave, or burn. The syndicate broke. Later, in the ruins of the village, Jace found Lyria collapsed by the fire. He gathered her into his arms, her body limp, her breathing shallow. "Stubborn," he murmured. She smiled weakly. "You too." Vorik approached, his expression grim. "The power drains her. Each time, it takes more." Jace's chest tightened. "How much more?" No one answered. The stars were bright that night. Jace sat on the cliff's edge, Lyria leaning against him. Her glow had faded, but her warmth remained. "You could leave," she said softly. "The bond's fulfilled. You're free." Jace looked at her, at this fierce, impossible woman who'd upended his life. "Yeah," he said, "but I don't want to be." Lyria's breath hitched. Jace kissed her, slow, deep, a promise. Somewhere in the dark, the twin moons washed over them, and for the first time in his life, Jace Vero was exactly where he belonged.